is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at UPNradio.com.
One of them wanted to be the security guy. He claimed he was a security guy.
All right. Welcome to Security Guy Radio.
Thanks for having me.
I'm here in beautiful Portland, Portlandia, as I like to refer to, with Monica Graves, writer, director, producer, all three,
Yes.
right? Of A Woman's Place. It's the name of the film, A Woman's Place. And we're going to get a hold of you by going to awomansplacefilm.com, right?
Yes. And it's woman's as in one woman with an A.
Yes, right. That is a little confusing, but no apostrophe, no possessive in there, right?
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was on Twitter or Facebook or something, and I'm always looking at domestic violence and things like that. And I saw you guys tweet something, and I said, I'm going to be in Portland. I want to stop by and take a look at that. It seems interesting. Tell us about the film. You have a two-part initiative on it, and you're trying to make a movie here. And tell us what it's about.
Yeah. Well, the film's called A Woman's Place, and it's a story about domestic violence. It follows a woman named Faye Bannister, who's living in poverty in the beginning of the story. And it follows her and goes with her through all the horrific things that she has to go through to get out of a domestic violence situation.
Now, you described her as growing up in a cycle of neglect and abuse. I thought that was a really good way to describe it.
Yeah.
Because it is kind of a cycle.
It is a cycle in a lot of ways. In an abusive relationship, it's a cycle that goes through things that seem really good, tension that builds, and then a big explosion, which keeps going round and round. But also, it's a cycle because one of the main elements of domestic abuse is mental. As much as we see the physical, a lot of it's mental. And once you've been made to believe that you're not worth much, after you get out of the relationship, if you aren't healed, you go back into similar relationships because that's what you believe you're worth.
Right, and that's what you're comfortable with, by the way.
And that's what you know and we like what we're familiar with as human beings.
Which is ironic because if you're familiar with violence, you gravitate towards violence.
It's very true.
It's very interesting. Now, I don't like to usually let facts get in the way on the show here, but sometimes it's interesting to do that. So let's define domestic violence. I've heard it defined as a pattern of behavior used to establish power and control. I think that's a good way to describe it.
I think so, too, yeah.
So the abuser, and by the way, it can be men or women, and there was about 3 million men abused last year, physically assaulted, right? And that's not the psychological part.
It can be children, too.
And children, that's right. Yeah, it's not about the violence. It's violence is used as the control mechanism. In other words, there are people that are sadists, like to go around beating people in general and that kind of thing. But if it's not physical, there's more psychological. In my experience as a policeman, I think there was more psychological stuff going on. I think there was more verbal abuse, verbal assaults, and it got to a point where somebody might pop and hit you. But I think it's more difficult when you're involved in the verbal part. What do you think?
Yeah, well, since we started this film project, I've had a lot of people come to me and talk to me and meet with a lot of people who have been through domestic violence. And I want to say every single one of them who has been physically assaulted said they would take the physical violence over the mental and emotional abuse any day. And I think also the physical violence, it's easier to prove and you feel, I think it's an easier thing to get out of because it's so clean and clear, where the mental and emotional, these men aren't monsters or women aren't monsters walking around on the street. They're humans just like us. And a lot of them are very good manipulators. And so the people on the outside think they're a good person and they're going to manipulate those, as a victim, they're going to manipulate people and try to make those people think I'm the bad guy.
Right, very narcissistic and manipulation is the key because they do appear outwardly that everything's fine.
Yeah.
And also, not only does it appear that way, there's trigger mechanisms involved in all this, right? So there's no trigger involved in going to work and having your boss make you the best guy in the project and everything's fine because that's not what you're controlling. You want to control your home life or your partner and things like that. So it's a lot different. 1 in 4 women, they say, are a victim of domestic violence. I think it's higher.
I do
frankly.
too.
I think it's probably 6 in 10 of some degree, because I'm going to define domestic violence very broadly. I'm going to say if you have your head up your ass and you yell and scream at your wife, or vice versa, your husband, you're starting the cycle, right? And we all go a little nutty once in a while. That happens. It's the ability to recoup and cope with what happened in the eruption that will take it out of the domestic violence cycle, right, and bring it back to normalcy. So let's talk about some people call it the clock, the cycle, the chart. Talk about that.
Yeah. So if you Google domestic cycle or domestic violence cycle online, you'll see tons of images. And what these images show is something called the honeymoon period, which is like the good, happy, you enjoy this person, you're having all kinds of fun.
That's noon. If you make it a clock, that's like noon. Think about it that way too.
Yeah, well, I think it's different on each one. From like 6 to noon, it's kind of like half the time maybe things seem good. And that's what you enjoy, and that's what keeps a lot of women in the relationship. And then there's a tension building portion where that's where the women and the or whoever the victims are, women and children, maybe it's the husband and children, are walking on eggshells because they can feel like it's building. When's he going to explode?
Right.
And then there's the violent event or the episode, whatever that is, whether it's suicide threats or angry yelling and threats of who knows what, taking the children. And after that, after the large explosion, it goes back into the honeymoon phase. And it's interesting. I met with a woman recently who she has an initiative she's working on to raise awareness about domestic violence, but she said she would push during that tension building time to get to the explosion because she wanted to get it over with and she knew it was coming.
That's interesting.
And I thought, wow.
It's dangerous.
Yeah.
Can be dangerous, but interesting.
But she knew inevitably it was going to come,
right,
and she wanted to get through it, and so she would push to try to get it there so it could go back to that honeymoon phase.
You hear from suspects when you lock them up in the car. What are you so angry about? She kept pushing me. She kept pushing me. She kept pushing me. And so you wonder if that's something people ought to focus on looking at. If that's intentional or unintentional. What's some other facts here? Oh, now I do a lot of workplace violence stuff. I don't know if you knew this or not. Studies suggest that 40% of workplace violence, where somebody comes in and shoots the wife at work or something like that, that's got a domestic violence component. All workplace violence, right? So think about that. If we want to have less shootings in public places, let's work on the domestic violence component. And some people think that's even possibly more than that. And the clock you're talking about, most domestic violence happens between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Makes sense because you're in the house, right? That kind of thing. The shootings don't, though. The shootings happen more towards work hours if it goes to that point. And then 60% of it at home. That number seemed low to me. 60% at home.
Of the
domestic violence cases, yeah.
Oh, the cases themselves, or like the murders?
Well, I guess if you say, no, just in general, the stats say 60% of all domestic violence things happen at home, and if we got 40% in the workplace, maybe that's the 100% they're talking about. I don't know. Could be, ultimately, but I don't know where else it would be if it wasn't at home.
Yeah, I mean,
public places, I guess. I mean, maybe if you're ridiculing your wife in a restaurant or something.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's the whole public humiliation component of it as well.
So domestic violence is a third cause of homelessness among families. Yeah, and we talked about this before the show, that chances are, if you get divorced tomorrow, and even though you probably, you're financially stable and everything's good, you're probably going to wind up in poverty.
Yeah.
I found that very sad.
A person who's in a domestic violence situation, a lot of times they'll stay because it's like, well, I can stay and live with this, or I can be poor on the street with my kids.
Yeah.
That, those aren't two good options, really. But
no, and that makes it difficult, right? Because you and I might, well, me especially as a policeman, I might say, hey, let me get you out of here. Let's go stay at your sister's. And then what? Well, we'll figure it out. No, I don't want to figure it out because I have a life here, and I'm going to just deal with it. Like your friend, not your friend, but that person that told you about triggering the event to get over with, right? There's definitely a component where you have to make a choice in this as a victim. And I look at them as strong people. I know a lot of people look at a victim as not strong, but think about this person you just talked about. And I'll tell you another story real quick. So a friend of mine, Pam Patsitopoulos, was a DA in Chicago, and she had started the domestic violence unit over there. She had a case where a woman came in, fairly affluent family, kids in private school, blah, blah, blah. Guy was a fireman, used to beat her on a regular basis, serious stuff. And they said, we're going to prosecute him. And she says, well, no, I'm not going to testify. Because when you put him in jail and he loses his job and his pension, what am I going to do? I don't have any skills. Are you going to pay for my kid's private school and pay for me sleeping in my car?
Yeah.
And that made my friend Pam go, you know what? We didn't think about that. I don't know what that solution is. I mean, that's a tough one, right?
Yeah, and there are a lot of great organizations out there that have centers for violence victims to come and be at, like YWCA, and I think I'm going to get the other acronyms wrong, like the NNDEV. I think it's the other one, National Network Against Domestic Violence.
There's a lot of them on Twitter. If you hashtag domestic violence on Twitter, hundreds and hundreds of people trying to.
There are a lot of them, and those all need funded.
Right.
Like the money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, keep it a little close, just so we don't lose your voice. Want to get all the facts in there.
Okay.
Here's another one. 1/3 of New York City shelters have homeless families as victims. 1/3.
Wow.
That's amazing. 18 to 34 at the highest risk. Now, this I found surprising. You were telling us you got married very young. Mm-hmm. And I kind of see that because I guess if you're young and 18 and life and, that could be stressful. I thought it would have been higher. I thought it would have been somebody married a long time that just says, hey, this isn't working out or something. Any feedback on that from people that you're working with on this?
Oh, God. I mean, I've read the same statistic. The only feedback I have is that a lot of it's a little different than this, but a lot of times people have in their mind that domestic violence happens in poverty situations.
Oh, no.
You just gave an example, and the thing is, it doesn't. It's across the board.
Everybody.
Everyone is in a place that they could be suffering from domestic
Right.
violence, no matter their income, no matter their status. I mean, I'm guessing that, a young person gets married, and at 34, maybe if you've been in a domestic violence situation, you're probably at the point you'll get out.
Well, if you're that young, you may think that that's normal.
And that's true,
If
too.
that's your only experience, right?
Yeah, if you've not experienced anything else, you can't have been in very many relationships at that point.
Now, here's the saddest part. 2 out of 3 homicides of females are attributed to a family member or intimate partner. Could be somebody you're having sex with casually or maybe one time or whatever, or mostly a family member / husband / even siblings that happen sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Father, that kind of thing. That's the most serious part of all this stuff. It really winds up in death a lot more than you think it does if we don't do something about it.
Yeah.
And I applaud you trying to get this message out there. What I find ironic is in 2015, who doesn't know this goes on? Right?
Right. But a lot of people aren't educated about it, and they think it's just somebody getting beat.
Somebody else.
Getting hit. And
Right.
it's not anybody I know. And the reality of it is it's probably a lot of people you know.
Probably is a lot of people you know,
And
right?
a lot of time what starts out as psychological does escalate into murders. And that is really sad because your home should be a safe place.
Right.
And so I'm going to start crying. But it should be a safe place. And if you're living in domestic violence, your home's not a safe place. It's a place where you have to be frightened all the time and worried that your spouse may escalate to the point that they kill you or themselves.
The guy you love is going to kill you, and
Yes.
it's psychologically, that's just too hard to get your head around.
Yeah, and nobody should have to live in that
Right.
ever. And they should not have to be afraid to tell people what they're living in, and they shouldn't have to be afraid that nobody's going to believe them.
Yeah.
And
I think it's so many people. I mean, in the cop world, they say there's a high appearance of this. I'm not positive it's any higher than anybody else, right? Maybe. I'm not going to say it's not, right? But a cop would kind of look at your other cop buddy and say, well, that's my buddy. I'm a good guy. He's a good guy. But down below, we don't know. Do you think if people shared more, like if girlfriends and guys went to coffee and said, you know what, he smacked me today, do you think the friends would rally to help? I'm not sure that maybe they're afraid or they're a victim themselves and they want to get involved. I don't know.
I do think so. I think that people need to learn how to help. And one of the ways to help is just to listen and be supportive. It's not helpful to say, they're a bad person, you should leave them. It's helpful to say, I'm here for you if you decide to leave. We're going to find a place, to make sure they know that they have the resources they need when they're ready to leave. And I can also tell you, one of the reasons I decided to write this film is because I had so many women in my life that at one point or another said, this horrific thing happened to me, or maybe these multiple horrific things happened to me where I'm going, how are you still alive and functioning? And they had never told anybody.
What period of time? Like over years? Been
Yeah.
going on?
Oh, yeah.
Long
Over.
time.
I mean,
Not just the onset of one thing. It's been
Oh,
going
no,
on a long
no.
time.
Yeah. I mean, in some of these women, it's like situation after situation after situation. And I think part of that is because they didn't have self-worth because it started at such a young age for them.
Right.
And one woman in particular who's probably the biggest inspiration for me in writing this, I've lost contact with her, but to my knowledge, she's never been able to actually function in a healthy relationship.
Did she get out of the first domestic violence thing?
She did, but she's never been able to have that self-worth that you need to be in a healthy relationship. And that's where we need to not only get them out of those bad situations, but there needs to be an education that helps them to learn that they're worth something.
Right.
You know, that they're worth more than that.
I've always thought that a lot of this has to do with social groups. And you'll find, I do think you do find more domestic violence in some sort of groups. I think. I mean, and it's cultural. And certainly we see this now with all the terrorism going on, right? Those cultures are like, really? You're going to cover me from head to toe in a black cloth?
Yeah.
And that's a good way to treat women? Is it even a neutral way to treat women? No. It's because you have some kind of psychosexual problem that you don't want anybody to look at your girlfriend. And it's just weird to me, right? So that's the extreme, right?
Yeah.
I'm always curious to wonder if there was a domestic violence component beyond that. In other words, do they treat their wives okay at home? Because in public you can't take a picture of it. You don't know.
Right.
But I just think that sort of approach right there is bad, right?
Well, and it's interesting because I believe, if I've read this multiple places, but the more conservative that a culture is, the higher the sex crimes.
Higher the sex crimes?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that's very interesting because it's like it's being hidden. Sexuality is being hidden and not spoke about, and now there's more.
Well, that makes sense. There was a case in, I think it's Rottingham, England, that for 14 years, this town of predominantly Pakistani men were raping 12 and 13-year-olds systematically for years, right?
Yeah.
And the reason the police who knew about it didn't do anything about it is because, well, there was a law in England that says you can't attribute, a culture to a hate crime and all kinds of crap and nonsense. And they kind of looked the other way until some woman who had become of age wound up in a homeless, wacky shelter, and they started interviewing her saying, 5 years ago, this is what happened to me. She never came back into society. She was just on the streets and stuff. And then covered this huge thing. And, I mean, that's domestic violence. Now, they may say that's really more of a crime. It's more of a... Listen, crimes against women, all right? If we didn't have any women, we wouldn't exist, all right?
Right?
It's just the way it goes.
Treat us better.
Exactly, right? Right? So I'm going to classify that kind of thing as a domestic issue because, ironically, what happened was a lot of the parents involved kind of knew about things. But because of the threats, and they would take these girls out and pour gasoline on them and say, I'm going to light you on fire if you tell your parents. I mean, that's psychological abuse you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That it went on for this long.
Yeah.
And nobody is standing on top of a soapbox or getting pitchforks and saying, let's get those guys and let's put the police in jail for not doing anything about it, right? So when we're silent about this issue, I think it just brings the whole quality of the society down. Quality of life.
It does.
I don't know. I mean, go ahead.
Well, you just made me actually think of we're making a film, but we also are working on something that we want to raise awareness to also, and we have a hashtag called A Woman's Place.
Yeah, this is your part two.
It's part two. Yeah, it's a social media campaign we're working on building, and it's about women being proud of who they are, basically. Because as a woman, you are ridiculed in so many more ways than men. I mean, let's just look at childbearing. If you breastfeed, somebody hates you. If you bottle feed, somebody hates you. If you decide to work at home, you're wrong. If you decide to just be a stay-at-home mom, you're wrong. If you decide to work away from home, put your kids in childcare, you're wrong. Men don't have any of it.
Well, I'm not. I won't agree 100%. But you're right. There's more. But here's the difference: when a man does it, if you do that to me, I say, "This is for you, and this is for your horse," and I'm going to have a confrontation with you, right? So women are not confrontational. It's just the nature of things, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's easier to, if you're weak on the attacker side, it's easier to throw those things out and throw those slurs and put people down and stuff like that. And it's really kind of psychobabble, right? Because you're not breastfeeding's bad, but a bottle's also. You're right. It's insanity. It's insanity.
It is, and it's like women shouldn't be putting down other women. They should be proud of who they are, and they should also speak out about like, hey, okay, I'm a director in a man's world.
Right.
This industry is full of men, and I mean, you can find documentaries all day long about how difficult it is as a woman to break into it. But this is what I know I'm supposed to do, and so as a woman, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to tell other women, you can do this
just
too.
do it. You know,
if that's what you want to do, it doesn't matter. And so we do want to empower women to realize, especially young girls, whatever you want to do, you can.
Well, especially nowadays. I mean, I have my little GoPro camera, my Zoom recorder here, right? And I just decided one day I'm going to go start a radio show because anybody can do it now.
Yeah.
Because of the technology
Oh,
available.
yeah, so
and that really
accessible.
empowers people if you got the motivation and the idea. I've always wondered about the other cultural side of it. So I'm Irish. We talked about this, right?
Okay.
In Irish culture, I mean, it's not 100%, but if you look at history, there were Irish queens and Irish kings, and they both existed together. And queens were looked at as equals to the
Okay.
kings. And I'm talking about separate queendoms and kingdoms. In other words, down the road, there was a queen, and over here's a king. Not related, right? Mm-hmm. And the culture was such that women were considered strong, and they bore the children, and they were valued more that way. In fact, there was a female queen. I think her name was Mauve. I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Mauve. Anyway, she's credited with kicking the Vikings out of Ireland, right? She led the war on that kind of stuff. And then way back in the day, the Catholic Church was deciding where to have the seat. Was it going to be, Rome or Ireland? And they went to a conference, and St. Patrick was there, and they had a vote, and it voted for Italy. And Italy and Rome was a hierarchy. I'm God, and here's my number 2, the Pope. Here's all the bishops and the cardinals, right? And Ireland, that was not the culture. It wasn't a hierarchy. It was we coexist, we work together, we fight each other, we kill each other, we have wars. But there wasn't necessarily you're the boss unless it was decided, right? And I always wonder historically if the Catholic Church, who's been very influential in, well, let's be fair, not being the best treatment of women. Let's be fair, okay?
Yeah.
If it had flipped the other way, if we would have maybe had a different culture with more respect for women.
Yeah.
So
That's
I
an
don't know.
interesting thought.
Yeah, there's just so many dynamics going on there. So tell us a little more about this character in your movie and the plot and where she's come from. Any autobiographical stuff? You don't seem like that, but I'm just asking.
No, it's I've been asked this before. It's kind of a culmination. Why can't I say that word? It's a
Collection of people?
A collection of people
Yeah.
and stories that I've heard. And it's funny because the beginning of the film is rather intense. We see her basically living with no power and water in this tiny little shack in the middle of nowhere. We think she's alone until her husband comes home and takes advantage of her in a not so nice way. After which some things happen. She ends up in a women's shelter, and there's someone there that is not a good person,
Right.
that also takes advantage of her. And in the original script, those weren't the only 2 times that happened, because I know women who have been raped and molested more times than you could even believe, and they've told me stories, and I've thought, why aren't you dead? How are you living?
Why isn't the guy dead?
Right.
Well, seriously.
That's true too.
Yeah.
And but I had to take some more of those things out because I realized people can't stomach this. And it's still pretty intense, but it's not as intense as the lives that some women have lived.
I encourage you to keep it in.
Well, I've kept several instances in.
I mean, look,
and the
look at
funny
all the
thing
junk
is,
you see on nowadays that's just grotesque and, what's the word for it? Just extra. I mean, you don't even need it.
Yeah,
It doesn't help the story.
It doesn't help the story. It's
Right.
there to bring in ratings, and
Yeah.
which is ridiculous. But my goal with this story was to show that this woman who had been through these horrific things was able to heal and to go on, and to, in the end, she actually gets a degree. She opens a home of her own to help other women, and she's able to function in a normal relationship with a man that's not codependent, where she understands her worth. And I think there's power in hopefully for a victim to see that, like, she was a victim,
Right, and this is
She
not
got through
this is
it.
not a true story, but it's based
No.
on vignettes and true stories.
It definitely has things
Yeah.
pulled into it,
And it's
that
all possible. All those things can happen.
Yes.
So let's talk about re-victimization, because you just touched on it a minute ago when you said she leaves to go to a shelter and then the shelter victimizes her. That happens a lot.
It does happen a lot, and it's sad. And in no way am I saying shelters are bad.
Right.
I haven't written that, but
But they're re-victimized not just in that area. I see this in divorces because my private eye business, I used to do a lot of divorce cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you meet the couple sometimes, or you don't even look at the backgrounds, and you go, everything seemed fine until some kind of tipping point,
Mm-hmm.
and then it gets nasty, right? Really, that's the mother of your children, and really, dude, you're going to say that didn't
Right?
happen.
Oh.
Or on the women's side, because they have no power, they create scenarios where there's just absolute nasty, vindictive, terrible things going back and forth. And they're actually, I think, re-victimized in some of these divorce cases, because now they're made to relive everything. Now they're made to defend lies.
yeah,
A lot of times, right? On both sides, I'm saying male and female, I think this happens. And that part to me, I don't know. I haven't been through that, but it almost seems to me like the worst part of the whole thing. Because you think you're out, but guess what? Now you have to deal with visitation rights with the guy who beat you, and he gets to come over and take your kids. I mean,
Yeah.
that's tough stuff, you know.
Yeah. No, I can imagine that would be a really difficult thing to go through.
So what else do we look at? Give me some of the things you're trying to get out as a message in the film that are it's tough stuff, but it's got a positive.
Yeah, it does.
Message,
it does
right?
have a positive message. And the big positive message is you can get out of it, and not only can you get out of it, but you can break that second cycle of not going back into that relationship, of becoming a healthy person emotionally and being able to function like a normal human being. Because sometimes after you've been through this severe emotional abuse, you apologize for everything you do, or
I've seen that, yeah.
You're afraid of a lot of things. You're afraid of making mistakes because you've been punished for mistakes in a
I
relationship.
interview a lot of people in domestic violence and a lot of women, and let's say we're talking on the phone, setting up an interview, and I get busy and say, listen, I got to go because I got to, I'm sorry to keep you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry, what do you? and I hear that go, there's nothing to be sorry about, but they are very apologetic, and I almost can spot a victim of domestic violence as using that as a tip. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does make sense.
Yeah.
Because you've learned behaviors to keep another person happy.
Oh, I didn't think about it that way. Okay.
You're trying to keep them happy, to keep them from doing whatever
Right.
it is that they're going to do. But anyway, so the positive of the film is you can get out. You can get better, and you can function as a healthy person in a relationship eventually. It does take time. It's not something where you get out and you run into the arms of some other human being and
Right.
everything's all better, because that's not how it works. Another relationship doesn't make it all better. So that's kind of the positive message, I guess.
Do you think there's a mental illness component in some of these things?
Oh, I'm sure there is.
There's some stuff. I mean, I just interviewed somebody here in Portland, Sheila Hamilton. Her book's called Things You Never Knew, and about her husband was bipolar, and she didn't really understand that what was going on at the time, right? But the statistics on that are, men especially that are, kind of 50-ish and white, and they don't feel good, they're popping pills now, and that's causing all kinds of problems. Domestic violence. It's bipolar, really, technically, but there's domestic violence because they act out on that kind of stuff. Does your film address any drug use or anything? Because drug use is a huge component in domestic violence, ironically.
It does not address
Yeah.
that. Her husband is an alcoholic, but we see very little of that in the beginning. Well, I guess there's some drug use in it too. Okay, wait a minute. It's very little though, and minimal. It's not a focus at all of the film.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, a couple more stats here. Kids. Let's talk about kids, because people forget about this. So about 3 million kids witness domestic violence every year. And I think when you're in the moment and it's emotional and you're on screaming, you're thinking there's not an effect there. There's a huge effect on children, these kind of things. And they say that kids who witness domestic violence as a group have more overall general health problems in life.
Wow.
That's kind of interesting, huh? And then they have more likely to intervene. Now, I had this with my mom. When our parents got divorced, she had somebody in the house and roommate. I don't, quote, roommates, right? 10 years old, whatever the hell that meant. But anyway, I wake up and there's a big fight going on and blah, blah, blah. And, I tried to get in and defend my mom, and I got smacked by some 20-something-year-old across the room. And people forget that kids are going to try and defend their parent, whichever parent they want to side with, right? And that makes it very dangerous for the kids.
Yeah,
become
it
victims
does.
that way. And the most ER victims, socially and financially, when most victims go to ERs, they discover that the victims are socially and financially isolated. In other words, who's going to pay for this? I don't know. You got insurance? No. Who's your friends? I don't have any friends. And this is where I think they started seeing some of these dynamics in there, where your female character in the film seems to be that way, really isolated, separated, no base, no support, things, something like that.
And abusers do that to their victims. They
Right.
try to isolate them from their family and from their friends, and to even make them feel like those people don't like you, they think this about you, they like me, whatever. Because if they can keep them isolated, they can control them more.
What do you think is the number one issue in domestic violence? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this, but what do you think is the number one thing that really people need to know about this?
That it's very common. That it's a lot more common than we realize. And if we don't do something to change it, and our family dynamics continue to stay this way in such a large hidden population, our society is going to be reflecting that.
It's going to implode.
And our children are going to grow up angry, and there's going to be more crimes. And if we do something to fix that family dynamic, get those people help that need help, teach people how to function not in a non-codependent relationship, and that's going to greatly change our society.
It's interesting you say it that way. I really never thought about phrasing it that way. But it's way more common than people think. And therefore, if you knew that your neighbor had the same problem, you wouldn't feel embarrassed to talk about it. I don't think, right?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense that way.
Yeah. Well, and I can tell you this. Most women I know have been through some form of domestic violence in a relationship.
Oh, interesting.
I
Well, I got 9 sisters, and I may be wrong, but I don't know. I think they're pretty strong, but I guess it's possible. The stats are going to say if I got 9 sisters, 4 of them probably had a problem.
Yeah, and let me tell you this. I've sat at a table and watched, one person open up, after which all these other people you never would have guessed go, well, actually.
Oh, that's a good point.
Me too. Well, actually, me too, because suddenly they feel safe, and they feel like I'm helping them by sharing my story.
Right.
Which is kind of our goal with this film, is helping other women by sharing the story that you're not the only one. This is happening to a lot of women. They're all afraid too. Don't be afraid. Find there's all kinds of hotlines you can call or whatever to get that help you need. We have to make a part of the dialogue, not the secret dialogue, but the open dialogue. Yeah.
So it's funny you should say that. This didn't dawn on me until just now, but I teach workplace violence, how not to get shot, and we have to teach domestic violence components because 40% of the time that's going to happen. Right. So one client had about almost a 70% female workforce. Huge, right? That's right. We can edit that out. Don't
over here in the corner.
And so naturally, with that higher female workforce, there was going to be a lot of domestic violence, restraining orders, things like that could give us indicators of, maybe your husband's going to come here at work, because that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? And we give this class, and in the middle of 2 of the classes, 2 women raised their hand and said, you know what? My husband did this to me for 25 years, and coworkers are going, what?
No idea.
You?
No idea.
My gosh.
Yeah.
And she goes, remember when I wouldn't come to work on every Friday because every Friday he went out drinking and hit me or something like that, right? So I think that's an excellent point, that things like this, we just have to talk about it. You know what? It's like talking about sex with your kids. Very embarrassing.
But it's important.
But it's important, and you got to do it. And if you do it at the dinner table and say, pass mashed potatoes, by the way, you're having sex with your boyfriend. Dad, what are you talking about?
Well, come on.
You got to put it in the context of it's okay to discuss.
Yeah.
It's not something to be ashamed of. It's all part of our life and quality of life and things like that. So I think that's a great point to make, that the more we talk about this and get it out there, the more we can feel empowered as the victim, right?
Yeah, empowered. Yeah. Like, it is okay. It's not right what they're doing to you, and it is okay to leave. It is okay to stand up for yourself and get out of that situation.
Now, where does your movie take place? In a fictional city, or is it
just in...
Do we know?
Tiny towns in America.
Okay.
Like, it's not going to be... I grew up in a tiny town, and in college learned to write what you know well. I know very small town dynamic, and so that's what I've written.
The reason I bring it up is because there's just a huge disparity between a law in California, a law in Illinois, a law in Oregon about the domestic violence.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that we can do, even just to interview, just to raise awareness that you have more rights in one state that you might in another.
Yeah.
But know those rights you do have as a victim of domestic violence, right?
Yeah.
There's a new law they passed in California that says if I pull the phone cord out of the wall during a domestic violence dispute, it's a felony.
Oh, wow.
1 year or more in jail.
Good.
So it is good.
Good.
And you think about, nowadays, it's a little behind, right? Because who's got a phone with a cord in the wall?
So if you smash their cell phone.
Well, that's the next thing that has to happen. Yeah, if you smash the cell phone,
where they
that's
can't
right.
get to it. Oh, God, here you just made me think of here's a very interesting thing about the laws. I read an article the other day. And the article is about a woman who at one point had been strangled by her husband. That was the first time that he had actually physically assaulted her. And she got out of the relationship for a while, but then didn't want to keep the kids from her husband, and so went back. And he ended up killing her eventually. And I don't remember if he stabbed her to death or shot her. But in some states, strangulation is not a felony, and you can't prove it necessarily that he just tried to strangle you or whatever.
Yeah.
But the statistics, if a woman's been strangled by her husband, it's like massive that he will kill her.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because I just learned that about a year ago. That is a new reveal in domestic violence.
Yeah.
It's something that has a very specific component that ends in death most of the time.
Yeah.
So if
And not then, but later.
no, almost always later, right? And not necessarily by strangulation either, by the way.
No, typically a different way.
Right, because you think about it, by doing that, that's different than hitting. It's different than punching. It's different than kicking. It's attempted murder technically, right?
Yeah.
And again, if you don't do it difficult, or some guys are smart and they use a towel or just no bruising and stuff like that, yeah, that's a good tip off.
Yeah.
The other thing that's a big component here is leaving. Okay, so you're most vulnerable and most at risk for death when you decide to leave. If you do it like pass the toast, I'm leaving you. Okay, that's not the way to do it. Okay,
Yeah.
and how they recommend is that you make the breakfast, give him a kiss, say thanks a lot. Maybe you have sex. Everything's great. You just make everything great, and then when he gets home, you're gone.
Yeah.
And there's no I'll call you later. There's no you're gone, and then you have to stay out of that area and stay away from him or her physically for a great period of time to get this all to kind of go back down. And what happens is, if he responds within that time period or doesn't respond, it gives you an indication where this is going to go. So he may just say, you know what, divorce, great, we're done. But this is where they might go into the stalking phase, the harassment phase, and now you know you have a more serious problem. So it gives you time to be safe, get to a place of safety, and then when you're safe, of course, we can all make better decisions.
Yeah.
Right? Not emotional decisions, but intellectual, like, hey,
Yeah.
I gotta protect myself, you know.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, and it's interesting because a lot of women are afraid of leaving because the husband threatens to take the children from her.
Yeah, and they
she'll
do.
never see her children again.
That's right.
And no one will ever let you have the children, or threaten suicide, and so there's that extra fear for a woman with children that he's going to do all these things if I leave.
Now, how far along are you in your production and your concept and all that kind of stuff? And let's get some money for you. Let's get some money.
Yeah. Well, the script's completed, and it actually received quarterfinalists at the one festival I submitted it to.
Oh, good for you. That's fabulous.
And so the script is completed. It's a feature-length film. It's 115 pages, which equals about 115 minutes on screen. And we have filmed a proof of concept that's only about 5 minutes long that we'll be unveiling this Thursday, actually, at a reception in Walla Walla with the YWCA. And that is the day we're kind of launching our public, hey, this is what we're doing. We're looking for money. We're mostly looking for donors and corporate sponsors. We have a fiscal sponsor, so we're able to offer a tax write-off. And because of the nature of the film, we think that is probably the best way to get the funding, is to find people who are also passionate about getting, raising awareness,
right,
to be involved on the financial end of it, that are looking at it as a way to give back and to get the message out there more than as an investment.
Excellent. My guest has been Monica Graves, writer, producer, director, mom of, you want to say,
8
children.
Kids.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. My mom had 7. I get it. I just, people that have a lot of kids can say that. I get it. And we're trying to raise money for her film, A Woman's Place. And by the way, the other thing that struck me is I like the title and the play on the words. And I don't know, maybe people my age get it. Maybe 20-year-olds don't get it. But it plays on A Woman's Place is
in the home.
In the home. A woman's place is barefoot and pregnant.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of those things, right?
There is.
And really, a woman's place is in society. And a woman's place is
wherever
to be equal.
she wants it to
That's
be.
That's it. That's it. Monica, thanks for coming on Security Guy Radio. I appreciate it.
Thank you.